Welcome to episode 2 of the Yes You Coaching podcast. I'm your host, Anna Manning, and today we're going to be talking about quieting your inner critic. And I'm going to teach you my pretty simple 3-step process for doing that. And this is something that I teach on and I coach on a lot because I'm a confidence coach. And the biggest thing that I see impacting people's confidence isn't actually what's happening externally. It's like not their external environment, it's their internal environment. And this component of your internal environment, so your inner critic, that critical dialogue, that critical narrative that you hear in your head, is the biggest thing that I see impacting people's confidence. So I end up talking about this stuff all the time and I love it because I did this work myself years ago when I finally learned to recognize and quiet my inner critic. I can tell you it was the best thing I ever did. So I'm going to share that with you today. And when I say inner critic, I'm guessing that you have an idea of what that means, but just think of it as any bit of the internal voice you hear which is critical. So that might be like a shaming voice, it might be a demanding voice, it might be an angry voice, but any part of that internal narrative which feels critical. So let's get straight into the 3-step process for quieting your inner critic. I'm going to take you through the 3 steps and then we're going to walk through them so that you've got a really good idea of how to think about each one. So, step 1 is to recognize the voice of your inner critic so that you can hear it in the moment. Step 2 is to recognize the impact that the voice of your inner critic is having on you. And step 3 is to create a new habit. So basically, form new neural pathways in your brain, create a new way of speaking to yourself, essentially, because that's what essentially the voice of the inner critic is doing. And I'm going to take you through all those steps in turn. And I can tell you that having done this myself and taught it to many people, it is possible to start recognizing and changing that voice of your inner critic. If it's pretty brutal now, you don't have to be stuck like that forever. So let's get into step 1. And that is recognizing the voice of your inner critic. So when I say recognize it, you might think, well, it's fairly obvious. I hear it like being rude to me. I hear it shaming me. I hear it telling me that I'm no good all the time. Yes, sometimes the voice of your inner critic is going to be really obvious. And sometimes it's not going to be so obvious. So, what we want to get to is a stage where you can really hear that voice in the moment as it's happening. And for most of us, it's the voice of your inner critic is so it's so much just a part of the background noise that you experience in your head every single day. It's just part of the norm, right? It's just it's just there all the time. So what we want to do is like bring it from being just part of the background noise to really bringing it into sharper focus, to be able to bring your attention to it when it happens. And it can feel pretty brutal at first when you first start practicing this step because the stuff it says isn't very nice, right? So you're really going to have to hear it. But trust me, it's the first step. So the first thing that I'm going to get you to think about is when does that voice of the inner critic pop up for you? When do you experience it? What situations do you notice it? So for some people, they will say it's when I'm doing something new, when I'm a bit out of my comfort zone, when I'm around certain people, when I'm, trying to deal with senior people. All those are pretty common. But what is it for you? When do you notice that inner critical voice popping up? And the second thing you want to think about, and I'm going to encourage you to actually write this down. Don't do that if you're driving, obviously, but this is a really important step. If you actually are committed to doing something about your inner critic, about changing, the way you hear that narrative, then I think this is a vital step. Write it down. What are the things that your inner critic says to you on a regular basis? It looks pretty brutal when you write it down in black and white. There's usually even a few tears. I think I cried the first time I did mine because, Jesus, I mean, you wouldn't dream of saying that stuff to other people. It's so rude and it's so mean and it's so harsh. But in order to start thinking and changing it, we really first have to face up to, like, what is it? What does that inner critical voice say to you? So I'm going to encourage you to take a minute and just grab a pen and paper and write that stuff down. And what we want to get to here, like I said before, is for you to be in a position where you really hear it in the moment so that you're able to almost take a pause. So before you get just hooked into what it's saying, you automatically believe it's what it's saying, then you're off thinking a million thoughts, you're feeling really terrible. You want to be able to hear it so you can take a pause and be like, I've been doing this work for years and I still hear an inner critical voice, but not nearly as much as I used to. But what happens now is when I hear it, for instance, if I'm, going to be recording a podcast, I might hear my inner critical voice be like, yeah, that's shit. No one wants to hear that. And in the past, I might have thought, oh, maybe it's right. Maybe it is shit. Maybe no one does want to hear it. Right. And that maybe would have put me off doing it completely. Now, if that thought like enters my brain, I not only hear it, but I can take this pause where I'm like, okay, so that's what my brain's coming up with today. Some days that's easier than others, but that's where you're aiming to get to. So think about the situations where it pops up and really strongly encourage you to just write it down. So that's step one, learning to recognize the voice of your inner critic in the moment where it is speaking. So step two is about recognizing the impact that your inner critic is having on you. And like I said in step one, for most of us, this is such a part of the background noise in our brain that not only do we half the time not even realize it's happening, but we probably don't stop to consider what the impact is when this voice is taking a hold, right? When we're believing what it says, when we're really tapped into it and listening to it. But I want you to imagine what would happen if your boss, for instance, said the stuff to you that your inner critic says to you at work. Right? Imagine your boss said all day, every day, because that's, let's face it, that's when your inner critic is operational, when you're awake. Imagine if all of the time you're at work, your boss was saying that stuff to you. Oh, that's going to sound crap. Oh, you're probably going to mess that up. Oh, don't say that. You might sound stupid, right? How would you feel if that was your reality? If that was your boss? Most of the time when I ask this in a class, people are like, I would raise a grievance. I would say I'm being bullied. I would leave, right? I would fire myself. You're like, yeah, absolutely. If you were in a relationship, a working relationship, or even a close relationship with somebody who was speaking to you in the way that you speak to yourself, what would that result in? For most of us, I imagine it would feel pretty painful. I think your confidence would be reduced, would be eroded. You would start to second guess yourself all the time. You wouldn't feel very brave. You'd probably feel quite demotivated, scattered. And for some of you that are listening to this, you may have had the experience of being in a relationship that was like that, with a boss or a team or a person, right, who spoke to you like the way that your inner critic speaks to you. So you will know how that feels. And for the rest of you, you can imagine how it would feel. And why wouldn't you want to be in a relationship like that? Why wouldn't you want a boss like that? Why wouldn't you speak to any of your team members like that? Your staff, your employees? And it's pretty obvious when you ask that question. The answer is because one, that would just be an awful way to treat somebody. But two, you'd never get the best out of them if you were constantly pointing out their flaws and their failures and reminding them of how crap they were and how stupid they were going to sound and doubting their ability, pointing to everything that they got wrong. You would never get the best out of somebody working with them like that. Their confidence will be on the floor. They'd be too scared to do anything. They'd be like a rabbit in the headlights. And instinctively, we know that if we did that to a team member, that would be the impact that it would have. But for some reason, when it's us that's doing it, when the voice is just inside our own head so nobody else can hear it, we don't stop to consider the impact that is having on us. But I'm going to suggest the impact that the voice of your inner critic is having is exactly the same impact as if somebody else was saying it to you. I'm going to say that again. The impact that your inner critic is having on you is exactly the same impact as if somebody else were saying the stuff that it says to you. All right, that was a bit too wordy, but I hope you get the point. And actually, the research backs this up. So, the research, they've scanned people's brains when they're being self critical and when somebody else is criticizing them. And what they've seen is that it activates your fight or flight response, your stress response is activated when somebody else is being critical to you, which, yeah, standard. But that stress response is also being activated when you're being critical to yourself. And what we know is that when that stress response is activated, when your brain is preparing you to deal with an immediate threat, which is what's happening when you feel, when you feel that adrenaline, when you feel that cortisol, your brain's preparing you to deal with something that's an immediate danger. Well, that is the response that your body produces when you are being self-critical about a piece of work. The only problem with that is, one, you feel terrible. It makes you feel terrible. But two, it actually impairs your ability to use your brain in the way that you need to at work. So when that part of your brain is activated and you're in a kind of, let's call it a stress response, you can't use your executive functions as effectively. And they're the part of your brain that is responsible for processing complex information, for organizing, for planning, for connecting ideas, right? All of that stuff that you have to do in your job is made harder when you are being self critical. So, what else happens for you when you're being self critical? Some of the things that people have shared with me is that they procrastinate. So they kind of flip around, think, oh, bit all over the place, clicking around on the computer, not really doing anything, going to get another cup of tea. Some people will say they just put off doing stuff completely, so they just completely ignore things and don't think about it. Other people have told me that it creates quite a lot of anxious feelings for them. So it might make them just feel more nervous. It might stop them doing something. So, not putting their hand up to take on a new piece of work, not being able to speak during a presentation, staying quiet in a meeting when they've got something to say. So, what's the impact for you? If you really think about the moments where you hear that inner critical voice and you kind of get hooked into it, what happens? How do you feel? What do you do? What does that result in? It might be difficult to think about this, but I promise this is a really vital step in stage 2. But now we're going to think about what is that inner critical voice actually trying to do, right? We're looking now at recognizing the impact of it, but the research shows that most of us associate that inner critical voice, that self criticism, with having some kind of useful function within our life. So we don't look at what it might be doing, which is bad, because we're like, oh, actually, yeah, that's how I manage myself. That's how I motivate myself. That's how I get things done. Most of us just kind of assume that that is the way of managing ourselves, that's the right way, right? That's the way. And we assume that somehow, I need that voice to get things done. I need it to motivate me. I need it to whatever, fill in the blank. It's got me this far in my career, right? But you may have been associating it with having a useful function in your life. But I want you to really examine that assumption. If I asked you, what is the best way that somebody else could motivate you? Would you tell me it was yelling at you like an army sergeant that was deranged? Probably not. But most of us assume that's the best way of motivating ourselves. It's a weird thought. I just think it's a weird thought error that we're exposed to because no one ever tells you this stuff. But think about it. Do you associate it with a useful function, like being motivating or helping you to get things done? And does it actually do that? You really want to question that. I'm going to suggest that most of the times when I address it with my client, it actually doesn't. It does the opposite of what they want. But consider it for you. So now we're going to go on to step 3. So we've done steps 1 and 2. 1, recognize the voice of your inner critic in the moment. 2, really recognize the impact that it's having on your life. And 3 is about creating a new habit. So creating a new way of speaking to yourself, a new way of managing yourself to quiet down the voice of that inner critic and maybe even use your own internal voice in a more encouraging way, in a more motivating way. So you might say, well, I've been speaking to myself like this for like 30 odd years. So that must just be how it is. I can't change. Well, you can. So Google neuroplasticity. It's a long, fancy, sciencey term, but basically it describes how our brains are plastic, i.e., they change. So you can create a new habit and a new neural pathway in your brain by doing something repeatedly. And then once your brain doesn't use the old neural pathway, so the old habit anymore, it prunes. It's really interesting actually, but it prunes those neural pathways that don't get used. And the ones that do get used just get stronger and stronger and stronger. Which is why, if you've always done things a certain way, it's really easy to do them that way because it's very efficient for your brain. And it can be more difficult to do something different. But what we know is that if you focus on something and you do some practice, you will form a new neural pathway. And if you don't use your old habit, you will prune, your brain will prune. You don't have to do it, right? Your brain does it for you. So you can develop a new way of dealing with yourself. So, first things first, decide what you need instead of that inner critical voice. I want you to think about this voice as being like an inner boss. Because let's face it, it's trying to do things, right? It's trying to either keep you safe or keep you motivated or whatever it's trying to do. But I want you to think about, what is the approach that the best boss ever would take with you? What is the approach that somebody would take that would just get the most out of you? That would help you to be at your most confident, at your most productive, at your most effective? Right? What approach would that person take? It's going to be slightly different for everyone. And write that down. What approach would the person take who would get the absolute best out of you? Because that is the blueprint for the way your internal voice needs to sound to get the best out of you. And maybe you thought of things like they'd be really encouraging, they would be respectful, they would remind me of things that I'm really good at, they would pick me up on a down day. They would say, I know this is hard and I know you messed it up last time, but you can definitely learn from this. Come on, give it another go. What would they be like? That is your blueprint. Decide on it, know what you need, and then tell your brain, right, this is how we're going to manage ourselves from now on. This is our new blueprint. This is how we're going to get the most out of our life, out of our work, out of our career, by installing a new little boss voice in our brain, which does the things that would actually get the best out of us. So, in order to quiet down that inner critical voice, I've got 3 ideas for you that have worked for clients. And you might find your own. But here are the 3 ideas. First, start testing what it is that your inner critical voice says to you. So here's a really common one. God, you're such an idiot. Fill in the blank. That's why you don't understand it. That's why you didn't get that client. That's why you didn't get that job, right? And instead of just believing what your brain is coming out with, I want you to think about just doing a bit of critical analysis. Yes, testing it slightly. Most of us believe whatever our brain comes out with, but that is a dangerous game. Just because your brain comes out with a thought, it doesn't mean that it's true, and it doesn't mean that you have to believe it. Honestly, it would be like reading the Daily Mail and just assuming that it's all true. My friend, you would not do that. You would be highly skeptical of the shit that you read in there. I want you to start being highly skeptical of the shit that your brain comes out with. And I'm going to give you a method for doing that. So I want you to ask, look at the things you wrote down, all right? Look at the particular thought that your brain comes out with all the time, your inner critical voice, and think, can I absolutely know that that's true? Right? Ask yourself that question, whether that's a yes or a no. And then I want you to find 3 pieces of evidence that go against that thought. So, oh, I'm an idiot and that's why I didn't get that client. Can I absolutely know that that's true? I, no, I can't absolutely know that that's true. And now find 3 pieces of evidence that go against it. Well, I, I, another 2 clients wanted to work with me this week. Um, I've worked with hundreds of clients in the past, and actually, that client might be a better fit for somebody else, so it might just be better for them and me that they don't work with me, right? There is just an example. So, can you absolutely know that it's true? And then I want you to find 3 pieces of evidence against it. And what we're doing here is we're just exploring the possibilities that your brain's inner critical voice might not be entirely accurate. The next one is a concept I developed called the zero tolerance policy. So I want you to imagine that your brain is like an exclusive club and you have a zero tolerance policy against, instead of drugs, you have a zero tolerance policy against critical self talk. Now, you might choose this to, you might choose to have a zero tolerance policy around all of your critical self talk, or you might just pick one area. So for me, it was around body shaming thoughts, right? My weight has gone up and down throughout my life. And I used to be very critical to myself when I was a bit fatter. And honestly, the stuff I would say to myself was pretty awful. And it made me feel so terrible. And one day I just thought, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. I now have a zero tolerance policy approach towards any body shaming thoughts that my brain comes out with. I drew a line in the sand and I stick to that line. Now, you wouldn't believe how effectively this worked. It actually, my brain literally stopped producing those thoughts all the time, but they didn't go away entirely. So now I have, like, imagine a little bouncer that's installed in my brain. And whenever I come out with a self critical thought, like a body shaming thought, my brain, like, very calmly but firmly says, I'm afraid we don't do that around here. So, where do you want to install your own internal bouncer? The next idea is to create some psychological distance. So I want you to imagine that you are hearing your friend say out loud the thing that your inner critic says to you. What would you say back to them? Would you be a bit more skeptical of the voice if you were creating that psychological distance? Some people like to imagine that they're hearing, like, even if they don't have a kid, they're hearing a kid that they have or that they love say, This is what I'm thinking. And what would you say to them? Like, oh, my love, like, no. Let me tell you why that's a load of nonsense. Another way of creating psychological distance is to create a character for your inner critical voice. Mine's called Brian. He's a pain in the ass, but I love him. So think about, like, what is the vibe of your inner critical voice? Create a character for them, animate it. Just don't make it a real human or anyone that you know, not your mother-in-law or whatever. And then learn to kind of recognize when they've popped up. Oh, like, hi, Brian. I see you've come to visit me today. Nice to see you. I won't be listening to you, but you're welcome to just sit in the corner. So there, that is the 3-step process for recognizing and quieting your inner critic. Listen to this episode as many times as you need to. I promise you, if you do this, if you go through these 3 steps, you will, like, revolutionize your life. I did, and it was completely amazing. It's been the best thing I ever did for myself. But also remember, you need to practice, right? Think about those new neural pathways that you're creating in your brain. This is new stuff. So practice, 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 and expect to fall off the bandwagon. You will. Lastly, if you want to do this work with me, there is a link in the show notes to my website. Have a look around. You can coach with me individually or as part of the Confident at Work program. The next round will be starting in September 22. Come and join us if this is impacting you at work, if this is impacting your confidence at work, and you want to do this work with me, you are warmly invited. I would love to have you. So that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for being with me until the very end, and I wish you success in recognizing and quieting your inner critic. Bye.